Afghanistan in the Cold War. The Soviet Union should have listened to the advice from Douglas MacArthur, and they should have listened to that scene from The Princess Bride. Do not become involved in a land war in Asia. Afghanistan is the graveyard of empire. So many have tried to roll through Afghanistan to conquer it for its strategic location, but they have all failed. Like the Vietnamese, Afghanis do not like being under the occupation of a foreign power, and especially if it's a Christian one. The old joke is that Afghanistan's national sport is guerrilla warfare. The Soviet Union and the United States became involved in Afghanistan in the mid to late 1970s. The Cold War competition was truly a global game for the two superpowers. This book here, Ghost Wars, details the American and Soviet activity in Afghanistan in great detail. Now, the Americans became involved in Afghanistan for mainly revenge. The CIA now employed a lot of Vietnam veterans who had bad memories of the Soviets helping the North Vietnamese army during the Vietnam War, and it was now time for the Americans to get revenge upon them. This is a picture of a Soviet tank being driven by North Vietnamese army people. The Americans, specifically the CIA, wanted to get revenge upon the Soviet Union, so they were going to look for a spot where they could kill Soviet soldiers by arming people that didn't want Soviet soldiers on their land, and that would be Afghanistan. The other reason was the United States wanted to protect their ally Pakistan from the Soviet Union, and the KGB, the Soviet intelligence agency. Now, in the big picture sense, the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan because they wanted a warm water port, because they didn't have one. So they were going to get one by consolidating their power in Afghanistan, and then later on, hopefully, be able to push into Pakistan. So that would give them a warm water port. It would also knock Pakistan away from being an ally of China and the United States. Now, on a local level, the Soviet Union wanted to kind of correct what was going wrong in Afghanistan. Um, the leader here on the left, his name is Mohammed Daoud Khan. He was the president of Afghanistan in the 1970s, and he overthrew the monarchy that had been ruling Afghanistan for quite some time. And he wanted to make Afghanistan a functioning and progressive republic where women would have equal rights and equal opportunity for education and jobs and all that stuff. But he didn't have time to do all this stuff because he was overthrown by the communists and executed in 1978. The communists took control, and and their leader, his name was Hafizul Amin. Now, he did such a poor job as a communist leader in Afghanistan that the Soviets were kind of embarrassed by this, and they didn't want a bad guy doing such a bad job anymore. And they actually believed he was a CIA agent by this point. So the Soviets got rid of him. They sent a special forces unit called the Spetsnaz into the Hafizullah Amin's palace, dragged him out and had him assassinated, and they replaced him by a guy by the name of Taraki, and then they proclaimed a new communist state in Afghanistan, which made a lot of Afghanis angry, especially the ones out in the mountains and the countryside. They did not want any foreign intervention in their country of Afghanistan, and they especially didn't want it from the Soviet Union, who were a godless country. So they were upset. So they started rebelling. They tried to They were rebelling against Hafizullah Amin and his government. Hafizullah Amin wanted help from the Soviets, so he invited them to send an army to Afghanistan to help squash this rebellion. This made the Afghani rebels even more upset, and now we had basically a full-on rebellion going on. So you have a rebel group that's fighting the Soviet Union that need help. What's the CIA going to do? They're probably going to get involved. So this is the opportunity they've been waiting for. So the first contact happened during the Carter administration. This is President Carter here. This picture would have been taken around 1978, 1979. The idea was, and it was really championed by his national security advisor here, Brzezinski. They wanted to allow the CIA to give money to Pakistan, so Pakistan could give money to the Mujahideen, who were the Afghan rebels, and then they could fight the Soviets for them. So they would send guys like this, Gary Schroen. He was a CIA agent. he was responsible for giving a lot of this U.S. money to Pakistan and other groups that they deemed worthy of money to fight the Soviets. This was the Pakistani intelligence agency, and they would give money to Afghani groups that they wanted to fight the Soviets for them. So the Mujahideen, this is kind of like a broad umbrella term for all of the Afghan rebels fighting the Soviet Union. They were not a unified force, but they used guerrilla tactics with great effect. Mujahideen rebels had sponsors from a whole bunch of countries. There were many countries involved. There were Saudis, there were British, Chinese, French, Egyptian, Turkish, Iran, Iraq. They were all there giving money to Mujahideen rebel groups to fight the Soviets. And so this made things very complicated, but they were very effective. The Mujahideen did a really good job of fighting the Soviets. The Soviets were not prepared for this. It's really hard fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan with tanks. The Mujahideen had some very skilled fighters. They were on their home turf. This is one of the many heroes, so to speak, of the Afghan Mujahideen resistance to the Soviet Union. His name is Masood. He would actually help the Americans 25 years later in trying to remove the Taliban from Afghanistan. Some other fighters that were pretty effective of killing Soviets at the time that were receiving aid from these countries was Osama bin Laden. Didn't see that one coming, did you? He was there. He was fighting the Soviets. He only hated the Soviets slightly more than the United States. Now, all of this freedom fighting, so to speak, was very attractive to the Western media. They thought Afghanistan was a very romantic place and a very exotic place. So National Geographic showed up and took a picture of Afghan girl. They made movies about the Mujahideen efforts. This is Rambo 3, so he showed up and started killing Soviets with the Mujahideen. James Bond even made a stop in Afghanistan in 1987 in a movie called In the Living Daylights, where he helped Mujahideen rebels or Afghan rebels fight off the invaders. This was a very, very, it was kind of spinning out of control in a way on what the CIA was doing here. They're creating a monster they really couldn't control. And this came very evident in the decision to send Stinger missiles to Afghanistan. Now, the Soviets were suffering a lot, so they changed their tactics. So instead of using conventional forces like tanks, they began to use a lot of special forces and attack helicopters named Hinds. Now they use, or Hind, sorry, they use the Soviet tactics very effectively. The Mujahideen asked the United States to provide them with missiles to shoot down these helicopters. After much debate, the Americans agreed. They gave surface-to-air missiles called Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen. And they were extremely easy to use and were very portable, and they shot down a lot of helicopters and other Soviet aircraft. This was a major turning point in the war. So many American missiles or American-made missiles were shooting down Soviet aircraft that there was a real debate within the Soviet Union about whether or not they can continue on the war. The gentleman on the left, his name is Leonid Brezhnev. He was a leader of the Soviet Union, very notorious for being a strong man. He really believed that what the Soviet Union was doing in Afghanistan was the right thing. And he was being challenged by the next Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He wanted to leave Afghanistan. He didn't think he was worth it. Gorbachev would end up winning that fight. And a lot of Soviets began to pull out at that point. But before the Soviets would even pull out, there was a lot of nervousness within the United States about the Afghan resistance. A lot of these Stinger missiles were left over, and there was a real fear that a lot of these Stingers would, once they stopped shooting at Soviet planes, that they would start shooting at American ones. So they wanted to try to get a lot of those back before the Soviets ended up pulling out. But the Soviets pulled out before they had an opportunity to do that. In 1988, even word of how poorly the war was going was reaching the Soviet public, and there wasn't much support for it. The war was extremely expensive, both in men and material. So nearly after a decade of fighting a guerrilla army that was funded by their superpower rival, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan. And so why did the Americans pull out of Afghanistan? They did it mainly because the Soviets left. With no Soviets left to kill, the Americans had no interest in Afghanistan anymore. So they simply packed up and left. So we have a power vacuum. So who's going to fill that void? That void was filled by the Taliban. There was a massive civil war that happened in Afghanistan between 1988 and 1996. There was lots of chaos. When the great powers leave, there's usually a power vacuum, and some people who came to power in Afghanistan who wanted to fight the Soviets end up staying, so they got involved. These are guys like Osama bin Laden was one of them. And so later on in 1996, one of these Mujahideen groups called the Taliban, it actually means students in the native language Pashto, took control. But there was also a group known as the Northern Alliance that was led by that Massoud guy we talked about, who stayed in the north in resistance to the Taliban. So the Taliban, what do they want? They want to bring Afghanistan back to a way of living that would resemble what it was like to live during the time of Muhammad in 632 AD. And this is not a very pleasant time to be in Afghanistan. Certainly, it wasn't great to be there under Taliban rule, but certainly a lot of areas now are still under Taliban rule, and it's not a very nice place to be. And so, what responsibility does the United States have to the people of Afghanistan for this? They created a lot of rebel groups and anti-Soviet, but they also became anti-American groups later on. So what responsibility do they have? And this will be there's a strong link between these two incidents. These two towers won't be there. Maybe a little bit later after the Soviet pullout. Now, the irony is Afghanistan used to be a very progressive country. This is a picture in 1975. These are Afghan women going to university. And then 15 short years later, they have to walk around like this. This was Kabul. This is the capital of Afghanistan in the 1970s. And that's what it looks like now. So there's a lot of differences, and it's a pretty tragic story of Afghanistan. You even look at how exotic this girl looked, back in 1980s, but how different she is now. So it's kind of a lot of these before and afters kind of show you how the Afghanistan's had a big fall from grace, and it's mainly as a result of it being an arena of the Cold War, and how the Soviet Union and the United States used Afghanistan for their own purposes, and then kind of left when it was no longer useful for them. So stay tuned for the next video. I look forward to making it.